All right, everybody, and hello. So, fascinating discussions about Monster, everyone, and thank you for that. So, for much what I'm going to say, many of your posts have already covered, but for a book like Monster, it tends to provoke a lot of really strong reactions. So, just want to make sure everybody is carefully distinguishing between our just sense of outrage and the nuances of Steve's situation. As such, I'd just like to share a few gentle reminders about major aspects of Myers' novel. First, when I read essays on this book, I'll sometimes see statements like this. Steve or James or Bobo are portrayed as monsters only because of their skin color. Strictly speaking, that's not true. They're portrayed as monsters because of murder. Now, maybe race makes it easier for certain people to be accused of monstrosity than others, and that's kind of Myers' point. But let's also just remember that it's not the only reason these allegations of monstrosity exist in the text. Murder is a big thing here. Likewise, it's so easy to think that Steve is truly innocent of the charges against him, and I sometimes see people making that case. However, Myers is pretty clear about this. Steve is in fact guilty, at least according to the strict letter of the law. He ends up being acquitted of felony murder, but only because of pure dumb luck. Loretta Henry, who is a very believable witness, she can't place Steve at the scene of the crime. Myers, though, does hint strongly that Steve did in fact agree to be the lookout, mostly because Steve wants to be seen as tough, like Osvaldo Cruz, and he wants respect from James King. So it's implied that he agrees to be the lookout. But there's also the fact that Steve lies on the witness stand. He tells the jury, I don't know James King all that well, but that's not true, and we know it's not true. Defense attorney Kathy O'Brien, she knows it too, and she's the one who encourages Steve to downplay his prior acquaintance with James King, which is why we have that scene with the cup flipping. One further complication for Monster lies in how difficult the concept of felony murder can be for non-lawyers like us. It basically means that if you agree to participate in a dangerous activity and somebody gets killed or injured as a result of that dangerous activity, you share equal responsibility for that crime. The classic case is bank robbery. For example, picture a couple of bank robbers killing a bank teller as they're getting him to open the safe. They're guilty of murder. But do you know who else is guilty of murder? The guy driving their getaway car. And really, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Imagine if it was your brother or sister or significant other who got murdered inside that bank. Wouldn't you want everybody responsible involved in that crime to go to jail? That's why Steve Harmon shares in the responsibility for killing Aguinaldo Nesbitt. And that's why I've seen some people argue that letting Steve get acquitted at the end of the book, at the end of the trial, that sends a wrong message to the young adult readers reading Myers' novel. At the same time, it's hard to disagree that when you're a kid as young as Steve, it's obviously nice, as he is, and he's a nice guy, that you deserve to have your life ruined by one bad decision. That can motivate an argument for why our current laws on felony murder might be unjust. It's just a hard issue all around. And if you ever go into criminal justice as a field, these are the sorts of questions you will be forced to answer. But anyway, let's also just observe just how hard Walter Dean Myers works to enlist our sympathy for Steve Harmon. For instance, Steve comes off much better in the text than either James King or Bubble Evans, who are both pretty atrocious individuals. In contrast, Steve is clean cut, he has a future career, possibly college-bound, and his school teacher, George Sawicki, a person in a respected position of authority, personally vouches for him. Those are all things that cause us to like him. And importantly, they're the things that cause juries to like him. And that's something Kathy O'Brien knows as well. She takes full advantage of it for Steve's benefit. These are all extra factors, positive forms of prejudice unrelated to the crime itself that work to mitigate the negative prejudice that Steve faces on account of his ethnicity. But finally, Myers does two other things that enlist our sympathies for Steve. First, we get a lot of Steve's own perspective. We see how scared he is, and we see how much his family loves him. That's not a perspective we were used to getting for our monsters in this course. like Grendel or The Wicked Witch of the West. And that's how come there's novels like John Gardner's Grendel or Gregory Maguire's Wicked. That's why those novels exist. They both try to get us to sympathize with their monsters by telling us the stories from the perspective of Grendel and the witch, respectively. Second, Myers does not spend much time humanizing Aguinaldo Nesbitt, the murder victim. It's telling that we tend to focus on the injustices of the American legal system rather than the murder of Nesbitt himself. That's the sort of outrage that Sandra Petrocelli invokes during her prosecution of the crime. But we don't feel that way because Myers deliberately leaves Nesbitt a faceless murder victim. We don't get testimony from his family members, for example, demanding justice for the crime. Now, that obviously is not the story that Myers wanted to tell, and that's fine. But it's good to remember that our criminal justice system does also at the same time unfortunately tend to punish crimes against minorities less frequently than crimes against other ethnic groups. Now, Nesbitt himself is a minority. From his name, I'm guessing probably Hispanic. But his murder goes only partially punished, at least according to the strict letter of the law, since Steve goes free. Anyway, these are just a few of the remarks I wanted to add for Monster. All in all, it's such a deeply rich book considering how short it is, which is why I just love teaching it. Here's a few other odds and ends that might be useful for some of you guys to know. I know some of you accuse the prosecution, Petrocelli, of being biased, but note that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Is the prosecution's job to be biased against the defendant, just like it's the defense attorney's job to be biased in favor of the defendant. But because they're both biased, that isn't really, a knock against either one of them. It's just how it is. The charge of bias is more important when it comes to the jury, who are the ones who have to make the decision here. There's also the issue of dialect, especially African American inner city vernacular. Steve is a relatively well-spoken young man, but James King and Bobo Evans, they aren't. They clearly speak an inner city version of African American dialect with slang, and that is prejudicial against them for the jury as much as their skin color. Now, granted, they actually are guilty of murder, of the crime they're being accused of, but it's also true that the kind of English, the dialect of English you speak, really has nothing to do with your moral character. But it's just one of those extra cultural associations that can work for or against people being accused of a particular crime, which can be highly prejudicial. So that's all I have for you. I'm glad many of you seem to enjoy the book. It is a rich one, and I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.